Bride kidnapping, Wikipedia article audio. Bride kidnapping, also known as marriage by abduction or marriage by capture, is a practice in which a man abducts the woman he wishes to marry. Bride kidnapping has been practiced around the world and throughout history. It continues to occur in countries in Central Asia, the Caucasus region, and parts of Africa, and among peoples as diverse as the Hmong in Southeast Asia, the Tzotl in Mexico, and the Romani in Europe. In most nations, bride kidnapping is considered a sex crime rather than a valid form of marriage. Some types of it may also be seen as falling along the continuum between forced marriage and arranged marriage. The term is sometimes used to include not only abductions, but also elopements, in which a couple runs away together and seeks the consent of their parents later. These may be referred to as non-consensual and consensual abductions respectively. However, even when the practice is against the law, judicial enforcement remains lax in some areas, such as Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, and Chechnya. Background and rationale. Africa. Bride kidnapping is distinguished from raptio in that the former refers to the abduction of one woman by one man, and is still a widespread practice, whereas the latter refers to the large-scale abduction of women by groups of men, possibly in a time of war. Some cultures today maintain symbolic bride kidnapping ritual as part of traditions surrounding a wedding, in a nod to the practice of bride kidnapping which may have figured in that culture's history. According to some sources, the honeymoon is a relic of marriage by capture, based on the practice of the husband going into hiding with his wife to avoid reprisals from her relatives, with the intention that the woman would be pregnant by the end of the month. Though the motivations behind bride kidnapping vary by region, the cultures with traditions of marriage by abduction are generally patriarchal with a strong social stigma on sex or pregnancy outside marriage and illegitimate births. In some modern cases, the couple collude together to elope under the guise of a bride kidnapping, presenting their parents with a fait accompli. In most cases, however, the men who resort to capturing a wife are often of lower social status, because of poverty, disease, poor character, or criminality. They are sometimes deterred from legitimately seeking a wife because of the payment the woman's family expects, the bride price. In agricultural and patriarchal societies, where bride kidnapping is most common, children work for their family. A woman leaves her birth family, geographically and economically, when she marries, becoming instead a member of the groom's family. Due to this loss of labor, the women's families do not want their daughters to marry young, and demand economic compensation when they do leave them. This conflicts with the interests of men, who want to marry early, as marriage means an increase in social status, and the interests of the groom's family, who will gain another pair of hands for the family farm, business, or home. Depending on the legal system under which she lives, the consent of the woman may not be a factor in judging the validity of the marriage. Rwanda. In addition to the issue of forced marriage, bride kidnapping may have other negative effects on the young women and their society. For example, fear of kidnap is cited as a reason for the lower participation of girls in the education system. The mechanism of marriage by abduction varies by location. This article surveys the phenomenon by region, drawing on common cultural factors for patterns, but noting country-level distinctions. Egypt. In 3 African countries, bride kidnapping often takes the form of abduction followed by rape. Bride kidnapping is prevalent in areas of Rwanda. Often the abductor kidnaps the woman from her household or follows her outside and abducts her. He and his companions may then rape the woman to ensure that she submits to the marriage. The family of the woman either then feels obliged to consent to the union, or is forced to when the kidnapper impregnates her, as pregnant women are not seen as eligible for marriage. The marriage is confirmed with a ceremony that follows the abduction by several days. In such ceremonies, the abductor asks his bride's parents to forgive him for abducting their daughter. The man may offer a cow, money, or other goods as restitution to his bride's family. Bride kidnap marriages in Rwanda often lead to poor outcomes. Human rights workers report that 1/3 of men who abduct their wives abandon them, leaving the wife without support and impaired in finding a future marriage. Additionally, with the growing frequency of bride kidnapping, some men choose not to solemnize their marriage at all, keeping their bride as a concubine. Domestic violence is also common and is not illegal. Ethiopia. Bride kidnapping is not specifically outlawed in Rwanda, though violent abductions are punishable as rape. According to a criminal justice official, bride kidnappers are virtually never tried in court. When we hear about abduction, we hunt down the kidnappers and arrest them and sometimes the husband, too. But we're forced to let them all go several days later, says an official at the Criminal Investigation Department in Nyagatare, the capital of Omudara. Women's rights groups have attempted to reverse the tradition by conducting awareness-raising campaigns and by promoting gender equity, but the progress has been limited so far. Kenya. Coptic Christian women and girls are often abducted, forced to convert to Islam and then married to Muslim men. South Africa. Bride kidnapping is prevalent in many regions of Ethiopia. According to surveys conducted in 2003 by the National Committee on Traditional Practices in Ethiopia, the custom's prevalence rate was estimated at 69% nationally, and highest in the southern nations, nationalities, and peoples region at 92%. A man working in coordination with his friends may kidnap a girl or woman, sometimes using a horse to ease the escape. The abductor will then hide his intended bride and rape her until she becomes pregnant. As the father of the woman's child, the man can claim her as his wife. Subsequently, the kidnapper may try to negotiate a bride price with the village elders to legitimize the marriage. Girls as young as 11 years old are reported to have been kidnapped for the purpose of marriage. Though Ethiopia criminalized such abductions and raised the marriageable age to 18 in 2004, this law has not been well implemented. A 2016 UNICEF evidence review estimated that 10 to 13% of marriages in the highest risk areas involved abduction, with rates of 1.4% to 2.4% in lower risk areas of the country. The bride of the forced marriage may suffer from the psychological and physical consequences of forced sexual activity and early pregnancy, and the early end to her education. Women and girls who are kidnapped may also be exposed to sexually transmitted diseases such as HIV/AIDS. Central Asia. Forced marriages continue to be a problem for young girls in Kenya. The United States Department of State reports that children and young teenaged girls are sometimes married to men 2 decades older. Marriage by abduction used to be, and to some extent still is, a customary practice for the Kisii ethnic group. In their practice, the abductor kidnaps the woman forcibly and rapes her in an attempt to impregnate her. The bride is then coerced through the stigma of pregnancy and rape to marry her abductor. Though most common in the late 19th century through the 1960s, such marriage abductions still occur occasionally. The Turkana tribe in Kenya also practiced marriage by abduction. In this culture, bridal kidnapping occurred before any formal attempts to arrange a marriage with a bride's family. According to one scholar, a successful bridal kidnapping raised the abductor's reputation in his community, and allowed him to negotiate a lower bride price with his wife's family. Should an attempted abductor fail to seize his bride, he was bound to pay a bride price to the woman's family, provide additional gifts and payments to the family, and to have an arranged marriage. The practice is known as Yukuthwalwe or simply Thwela in South Africa. Among Zulu people, Thwela, or bride abduction, was once an acceptable way for two young people in love to get married when their families opposed the match. Thwela has been abused, however, to victimize isolated rural women and enrich male relatives. In Central Asia, bride kidnapping exists in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Karakalpakstan, an autonomous region of Uzbekistan. Though origin of the tradition in the region is disputed, the rate of non-consensual bride kidnappings appears to be increasing in several countries throughout Central Asia as the political and economic climate changes. Kyrgyzstan. Despite its illegality, in many primarily rural areas, bride kidnapping, known as ala kachuyu, is an accepted and common way of taking a wife. Approximately half of all Kyrgyz marriages include bride kidnapping. Of those kidnappings, 2/3 are non-consensual. Research by non-governmental organizations give estimates from a low of 40% to between 68 and 75% of all marriages in Kyrgyzstan involved bride kidnapping. Kazakhstan. Bride kidnappings that involve rape do so to psychologically force the would-be bride to accept her kidnapper and his family's pressure to marry him, since if she then refuses she would never be considered marriageable again. Of 12,000 yearly bride kidnappings in Kyrgyzstan, approximately 2,000 women reported that their kidnapping involved rape by the would-be groom. The matter is somewhat confused by the local use of the term bride kidnap to reflect practices along a continuum, from forcible abduction and rape, to something akin to an elopement arranged between the two young people, to which both sets of parents have to consent after the act. Although the practice is illegal in Kyrgyzstan, bride kidnappers are rarely prosecuted. This reluctance to enforce the code is in part caused by the pluralistic legal system in Kyrgyzstan, where many villages are de facto ruled by councils of elders and executive courts following customary law, away from the eyes of the state legal system. Executive courts, tasked with adjudicating family law, property, and torts, often fail to take bride kidnapping seriously. In many cases, executive members are invited to the kidnapped bride's wedding and encourage the family of the bride to accept the marriage. In Kazakhstan, bride kidnapping is divided into non-consensual and consensual abductions, Kelly Simzais Alip Kashu and Kellis Siman Alip Kashu, respectively. Though some kidnappers are motivated by the wish to avoid a bride price or the expense of hosting wedding celebrations or a feast to celebrate the girl leaving home, other would-be husbands fear the woman's refusal, or that the woman will be kidnapped by another suitor first. Generally, in non-consensual kidnappings, the abductor uses either deception or force to coerce the woman to come with him. Once at the man's house, one of his female relatives offers the woman a kerchief that signals the bride's consent to the marriage. Though in consensual kidnappings, the woman may agree with little hesitation to wear the kerchief, in non-consensual abductions, the woman may resist the kerchief for days. Next, the abductor's family generally asks the bride to write a letter to her family, explaining that she had been taken of her own free will. As with the kerchief, the woman may resist this step adamantly. Subsequently, the groom and his family generally issues an official apology to the bride's family, including a letter and a delegation from the groom's household. At this time, the groom's family may present a small sum to replace the bride price. Though some apology delegations are met cordially, others are greeted with anger and violence. Following the apology delegation, the bride's family may send a delegation of pursuers either to retrieve the bride or to verify her condition and honor the marriage. In Karakalpakstan, an autonomous region in Uzbekistan, nearly 1/5 of all marriages are conducted by bride kidnapping. Activist groups in the region tie an increase in kidnappings to economic instability. Whereas weddings can be prohibitively expensive, kidnappings avoid both the cost of the ceremony and any bride price. Other scholars report that less desirable males with inferior educations or drug or alcohol problems are more likely to kidnap their brides. In Karakalpakstan, the bride kidnapping sometimes originates out of a dating relationship and, at other times, happens as an abduction by multiple people. Uzbekistan, the Caucasus, Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia. Azerbaijan. Bride kidnapping is an increasing trend in the countries and regions of the Caucasus, both in Georgia in the south and in Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia in the north. In the Caucasian versions of bride kidnapping, the kidnapped victim's family may play a role in attempting to convince the woman to stay with her abductor after the kidnapping, because of the shame inherent in the presumed consummation of the marriage. The Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia regions in the northern Caucasus have also witnessed an increase in bride kidnappings since the fall of the Soviet Union. As in other countries, kidnappers sometimes seize acquaintances to be brides and other times abduct strangers. The social stigma of spending a night in a male's house can be a sufficient motivation to force a young woman to marry her captor. Under Russian law, though a kidnapper who refuses to release his bride could be sentenced to 8 to 10 years, a kidnapper will not be prosecuted if he releases the victim or marries her with her consent. Bride captors in Chechnya are liable, in theory, to receive also a fine of up to 1 million rubles. As in the other regions, authorities often fail to respond to the kidnappings. In Chechnya, the police failure to respond to bridal kidnappings is compounded by a prevalence of abductions in the region. Several such kidnappings have been captured on video. Researchers and non-profit organizations describe a rise in bride kidnappings in the North Caucasus in the latter half of the 20th century. In Chechnya, women's rights organizations tie the increase in kidnappings to a deterioration of women's rights under the rule of Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov. In Azerbaijan, both marriage by capture and elopement are relatively common practices. In the Azeri kidnap custom, a young woman is taken to the home of the abductor's parents through either deceit or force. Regardless of whether rape occurs or not, the woman is generally regarded as impure by her relatives, and is therefore forced to marry her abductor. Despite a 2005 Azeri law that criminalized bride kidnapping, the practice places women in extremely vulnerable social circumstances, in a country where spousal abuse is rampant and recourse to law enforcement for domestic matters is impossible. In Azerbaijan, women abducted by bride kidnapping sometimes become slaves of the family who kidnapped them. In Georgia, bride kidnapping occurs in the south of the country. Although the extent of the problem is not known, non-governmental activists estimate that hundreds of women are kidnapped and forced to marry each year. In a typical Georgian model of bride kidnapping, the abductor, often accompanied by friends, accosts the intended bride, and coerces her through deception or force to enter a car. Once in the car, the victim may be taken to a remote area or the captor's home. These kidnappings sometimes include rape, and may result in strong stigma to the female victim, who is assumed to have engaged in sexual relations with her captor. Women who have been victims of bride kidnapping are often regarded with shame. The victim's relatives may view it as a disgrace if the woman returns home after a kidnapping. In other cases, the kidnapping is a consensual elopement. Human Rights Watch reports that prosecutors often refuse to bring charges against the kidnappers, urging the kidnapped victim to reconcile with her aggressor. Enforcing the appropriate laws in this regard may also be a problem because the kidnapping cases often go unreported as a result of intimidation of victims and their families. Marriage by abduction is also practiced by some patriarchal tribes of central India. Usually, the groom carries away the bride and the villagers chase them. If they are not found after a few hours, they are considered to be married. There are, however, different rules for different tribes. While not technically considered bride kidnapping, in central India, among the Bhil tribe, there is a large festival called Bagaria Festival where matchmaking takes place in a peculiar manner. Girls dance in the inner circle and boys in the outer. When the music stops, a boy may elope with a girl. Georgia. Marriage by capture is slowly dying today. The Indian government disapproves of it but cannot do much as it comes under the personal laws of the tribal community. An estimated 1,000 Christian and Hindu women are kidnapped and forced to convert to Islam and marry Muslim men every year in Pakistan. In Bali tradition, Balinese men historically must abduct women for marrying. East and South Asia. India. Pakistan. Marriage by abduction also occurs in traditional Hmong culture, in which it is known as Zijpajanium. As in some other cultures, bride kidnapping is generally a joint effort between the would-be groom and his friends and family. Generally, the abductor takes the woman while she is alone. The abductor then sends a message to the kidnapped victim's family, informing them of the abduction and the abductor's intent to marry their daughter. If the victim's family manage to find the woman and insist on her return, they might be able to free her from the obligation to marry the man. However, if they fail to find the woman, the kidnapped victim is forced to marry the man. The abductor still has to pay a bride price for the woman, generally an increased amount because of the kidnapping. Because of this increased cost, kidnapping is usually only a practice reserved for a man with an otherwise blemished chance of securing a bride, because of criminal background, illness, or poverty. Occasionally, members of the Hmong ethnic group have engaged in bride kidnapping in the United States. In some cases, the defendant has been allowed to plead a cultural defense to justify his abduction. This defense has sometimes been successful. In 1985, Kong Mua, a Hmong man, kidnapped and raped a woman from a Californian college. He later claimed that this was an act of Zijpajanium and was allowed to plead to false imprisonment only, instead of kidnapping and rape. The judge in this case considered cultural testimony as an explanation of the man's crime. Until the 1940s, marriage by abduction, known as qiangqin, occurred in regions of China. According to one scholar, marriage by abduction was sometimes a groom's answer to avoid paying a bride price. In other cases, the scholar argues, it was a collusive act between the bride's parents and the groom to circumvent the bride's consent. Qiangqin, though illegal in imperial China, was common in rural areas, and often became a local institution that could be carefully planned and undertaken in a public context. In one form of a typical qiangqin, the abductor would arrive at a woman's house flanked by around 20 men. While the friends carried the woman away, the groom would use scissors to cut off the woman's panties. The woman, struggling to preserve her dignity, would be unable to adequately fight off her abductors. The victim would then be taken to the groom's house, where the marriage would be consummated. Chinese scholars theorize that this practice of marriage by abduction became the inspiration for a form of institutionalized public expression for women, the bridal lament. In imperial China, a new bride performed a 2 to 3 day public song, including chanting and sobbing, that listed her woes and complaints. The bridal lament would be witnessed by members of her family and the local community. Indonesia. In recent years, bride kidnapping has resurfaced in areas of China. In many cases, the women are kidnapped and sold to men in poorer regions of China, or as far abroad as Mongolia. Reports say that buying a kidnapped bride is nearly 1/10 of the price of hosting a traditional wedding. The United States Department of State ties this trend of abducting brides to China's one-child policy, and the consequent gender imbalance as more male children are born than female children. There was a custom of bride kidnapping named Atoyamijo in Kagoshima. On June 19, 1959, a man who committed Atoyamijo was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for rape, in Kushira, Kagoshima. In Buraku of Kachi, there was the custom of bride kidnapping named Katagu. The practice of kidnapping children, teenagers, and women from neighboring tribes and adopting them into the new tribe was common among Native Americans throughout the Americas. The kidnappings were a way of introducing new blood into the group. Captured European women sometimes settled down as adopted members of the tribe, and at least one woman, Mary Jemison, refused rescue when it was offered. Several reports of bride kidnapping for religious reasons have surfaced recently. Most known are the cases of Elizabeth Smart in Utah and J.C. Lee Dugard in California. Both perpetrators have been convicted of kidnapping and sexual assault. Other cases exist within some fundamentalist or break-off groups from Mormonism around the Utah-Arizona border. However, accurate information is difficult to obtain from these closed communities. Most of these cases are usually referred to as forced marriages, although they are similar to other bride kidnappings around the world. Among the Tzoltl community, a Mayan tribe in Chiapas, Mexico, bride kidnapping has been a recurring method of securing a wife. The Tzoltl people are an indigenous, agricultural tribe that is organized patriarchally. Premarital contact between the sexes is discouraged. Unmarried women are supposed to avoid speaking with men outside their families. As with other societies, the grooms that engage in bride kidnapping have generally been the less socially desirable mates. In the Tzoltl tradition, a girl is kidnapped by the groom, possibly in concert with his friends. She is generally taken to the mountains and raped. The abductor and his future bride often then stay with a relative until the bride's father's anger is reported to have subsided. At that point, the abductor will return to the bride's house to negotiate a bride price, bringing with him the bride and traditional gifts such as rum. Among the Mapuche of Chile, the practice was known as casamento por capto in Spanish, and engapitun in Mapudungun. Helena Valero, a Brazilian woman kidnapped by Amazonian Indians in 1937, dictated her story to an Italian anthropologist, who published it in 1965. Bride kidnapping has been documented as a marital practice in some Romani community traditions. In the Romani culture, girls as young as 12 years old may be kidnapped for marriage to teenaged boys. As the Roma population lives throughout Europe, this practice has been seen on multiple occasions in Ireland, England, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Bulgaria, and Slovakia. The kidnapping has been theorized as a way to avoid a bride price or as a method of ensuring exogamy. The tradition's normalization of kidnapping puts young women at higher risk of becoming victims of human trafficking. Hmong culture. China. Marriage by capture was practiced in ancient cultures throughout the Mediterranean area. It is represented in mythology and history by the tribe of Benjamin in the Bible, by the Greek hero Paris stealing the beautiful Helen of Troy from her husband Menelaus, thus triggering the Trojan War, and by the rape of the Sabine women by Romulus, the founder of Rome. In 326 AD, the Emperor Constantine issued an edict prohibiting marriage by abduction. The law made kidnapping a public offense. Even the kidnapped bride could be punished if she later consented to a marriage with her abductor. Spurned suitors sometimes kidnapped their intended brides as a method of restoring honor. The suitor, in coordination with his friends, generally abducted his bride while she was out of her house in the course of her daily chores. The bride would then be secreted outside the town or village. Though the kidnapped woman was sometimes raped in the course of the abduction, the stain on her honor from a presumptive consummation of the marriage was sufficient to damage her marital prospects irreversibly. Sometimes, the abduction masked an elopement. Japan. The custom of fotina was widespread in Sicily and continental southern Italy. In theory and in some cases it was an agreed elopement between two youngsters. In practice it was often a forcible kidnapping and rape, followed by a so-called rehabilitating marriage. In 1965, this custom was brought to national attention by the case of Franco Viola, a 17-year-old abducted and raped by a local small-time criminal, with the assistance of a dozen of his friends. When she was returned to her family after a week, she refused to marry her abductor, contrary to local expectation. Her family backed her up, and suffered severe intimidation for their efforts. The kidnappers were arrested and the main perpetrator was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The Americas. United States. Mexico. South America. Europe. Roma communities. Mediterranean. Italy. Ireland. Malta. Slavic tribes. In religion. Catholic law. Islamic law. The exposure of this archaic and intransigent system of values and behavioral mores caused great national debate. In 1968, Franca married her childhood sweetheart, with whom she would later have 3 children. Conveying clear messages of solidarity, Giuseppe Saragat, then President of Italy, sent the couple a gift on their wedding day, and soon afterwards, Pope Paul VI granted them a private audience. A 1970 film, La Moglie più bella by Damiano Damiani and starring Ornella Muti, is based on the case. Viola never capitalized on her fame and status as a feminist icon, preferring to live a quiet life in Alcamo with her family. The abduction of heiresses was an occasional feature in Ireland until 1800, as illustrated in the film The Abduction Club. The inciting incident for the 12th century Norman invasion of Ireland was an instance of wife-stealing. In 1167, the King of Leinster Diarmait Mac Murchada had his lands and kingship revoked by order of the Irish High King Ruadra Ua Concobar as punishment for abducting the wife of another king in 1152. This led Diarmait to seek the assistance of King Henry II of England in order to reclaim his kingdom. In 2015, Malta was criticized by Equality Now, for a law which, in certain circumstances, can extinguish the punishment for a man who abducts a woman if, following the abduction, the man and woman get married. East Slavic tribes, predecessor tribes to the Russian state, practiced bride kidnapping in the 11th century. The traditions were documented by Russian monk Nestor. According to his chronicles, the Drevlian tribe captured wives non-consensually, whereas the Radomike, Vyatich, and Severian tribes captured their wives after having come to an agreement about marriage with them. The clergy's increase in influence may have helped the custom to abate. Marriage by capture occurred among the South Slavs until the beginning of the 1800s. Common in Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, the custom was known as atmitsa. The practice was mentioned in a statute in the Polit Saw, the 1605 Croatian legal code. According to leading intellectual and Serbian folk chronicler Vuk Karadžić, a man would dress for battle before capturing a woman. Physical force was a frequent element of these kidnappings. Bride kidnapping was also a custom in Bulgaria. With the consent of his parents and the aid of his friends, the abductor would accost his bride and take her to a barn away from the home, as superstition held that premarital intercourse might bring bad luck to the house. Whether or not the man raped his bride, the abduction would shame the girl and force her to stay with her kidnapper to keep her reputation. As in other cultures, sometimes couples would elope by staging false kidnappings to secure the parents' consent. In Catholic canon law, the impediment of raptus specifically prohibits marriage between a woman abducted with the intent to force her to marry, and her abductor, as long as the woman remains in the abductor's power. According to the second provision of the law, should the woman decide to accept the abductor as a husband after she is safe, she will be allowed to marry him. The canon defines raptus as a violent abduction, accompanied by physical violence or threats, or fraud, or deceit. The Council of Trent insisted that the abduction in raptus must be for the purpose of marriage to count as an impediment to marriage. Most Islamic scholars take the view that forced marriage is forbidden. Bride capture has been reflected in feature films from many cultures, sometimes humorously, sometimes as social commentary. Bride kidnapping is depicted as a frontier solution in the 1954 Hollywood musical Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. The 1960 Hong Kong film Kyangpan portrays the custom in the format of an all-female Shaoxing opera comedy, in which Xiaomeng plays a gender-bending role as a man masquerading as a woman. Bride kidnapping is displayed somewhat humorously in Pedro Almodóvar's 1990 Spanish hit Adam, starring Antonio Banderas and Victoria Abril. It is the underlying theme behind the 2005 Korean movie The Bow. In the 2006 comedy Borat, Cultural Learnings of America for Make Benefit Glorious Nation of Kazakhstan, the eponymous fictional reporter Borat, played by British comedian/satirist Sacha Baron Cohen, attempts to kidnap Canadian actress Pamela Anderson in order to take her as his wife. He brings a wedding sack which he has made for the occasion, suggesting that such kidnappings are a tradition in his parody of Kazakhstan. On a more serious note, a 1970 Italian film, La Moglie più bella by Damiano Damiani and starring Ornella Muti, is based on the story of Franca Viola, described above. However, before the national debate caused by the Viola case, a 1964 satire directed by Pietro Germi, Seduced and Abandoned, treated the Sicilian custom as a dark comedy. The 2009 film Biaria, La Porta del Vento shows a consensual fotina in 20th-century Sicily as the only way the lovers can avoid the girl's arranged marriage to a richer man. Some Russian films and literature depict bride kidnapping in the Caucasus. There is a Soviet comedy entitled Kidnapping, Caucasian Style, where a bride kidnapping occurs in an unidentified Caucasian country. The 2007 Kyrgyz film Pure Coolness also revolves around the bride kidnapping custom, mistaken identity, and the clash between modern urban expectations and the more traditional countryside. In 2005, a documentary film entitled Bride Kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan made by Petra Lom was presented at the UNF 2005 festival, and subsequently on PBS and Investigation Discovery in the United States. The film met controversy in Kyrgyzstan because of ethical concerns about the filming of real kidnappings. In 2012, the website Vice.com did a full documentary film about bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan. In Francis Bonney's novel, Camilla, the heroine's sister, Eugenia, is kidnapped by an adventurer called Alfonso Bellamy. Eugenia decides to stay with her husband on the grounds that she believes her word is a solemn oath. Eugenia is 15 years old, and so underage, and is coerced into the marriage. Both were grounds for treating the marriage as illegal. A Sherlock Holmes story features bride kidnapping. In The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, a woman is employed as a governess by a man who knows that she will soon inherit a fortune, with the intent of a confederate marrying her. The ceremony does eventually occur, but is void. The manga Otoyo Megatari, a bride's story, takes place in Central Asia. The heroine is married to a boy in an outside clan, but regrets regarding this decision occur when her original clan has problems bearing heirs. Her birth family comes to retrieve her with the intention of marrying her to someone else, but without success. Her new family tells the invaders that the girl has been impregnated, which would be the last seal on the marriage. They doubt this has occurred as the groom is very young and, desperate, they resort to a kidnap attempt, but again fail. The fantasy novel A Storm of Swords features marriage by capture as the traditional form of marriage north of the Wall. The free folk consider it a test for a man to steal a wife and outwit her attempts on his life long enough for her to respect his strength and come to love him. More often, though, marriages by capture are conducted between a couple already in love, an elopement without the extra element of attempted murder. Jon Snow and Ygritte have such a marriage by capture, although at the time Jon was ignorant of the custom and thought he was merely taking her prisoner. The Ironborn are also known to practice this custom, taking secondary wives while reaving the mainland, which they refer to as salt wives. The Tamora Pierce fantasy novel The Will of the Empress includes bride kidnapping as a major plot point and has extensive discussions of the morality of bride kidnapping. Multiple characters are kidnapped for the purpose of marriage during the novel, which is used as a warning against it, particularly in the case of poor women or those without social support systems. In the BBC radio and television comedy series The League of Gentlemen, the character Papa Lazaru comes to the fictional town of Royston Vassie under the guise of a peg seller. He seeks to kidnap women by entering their homes, talking gibberish to them and persuading them to hand over their wedding rings. He names them all Dave, and, after obtaining their rings, proclaims, "You're my wife now." In Criminal Minds, Season 4, Episode 13 titled Bloodline depicts bride kidnapping. In film, features, documentaries. In literature, in television, bibliography, books, journal articles, human rights reports, news articles and radio reports, dissertations and academic papers.